how we're going to start this, we're going to do 2 10-minute openings. And then after that, if you guys don't use the full 10 minutes, that's fine. I will then take the rest of the time that hadn't been used and put that towards the overall open discussion. But we don't normally do 45-minute open discussion. And then if you guys decide near the end, when the time is running low, that you want to go on for an extra 5 or 10 minutes, just let me know and I can add that on. And then after that, we will take the questions from people in the audience. And to let people know in the audience, we have a new system set up. We have the post that pops up every so often, but you just put at MDD stage question, and then you just put the name of the person you want to ask the question for, or both, if it's for both, and then your question, and then I can bring them up and ask the debaters their questions. So right now we are all ready up and set and ready to go. I got my timer up, and at this moment, I'd like to ask both of you, who would like to go first?
I'll let Jordan go first. 'Cause I think it makes sense because I'm sort of like arguing more the antithesis of what he believes. So I think you should go first.
Yeah,
Okay,
that
so,
sounds great.
Christian, go first.
Yeah, I'd be love to go first.
Oh, Jordan? Okay. All right. So you are free to go whenever you're ready, and I will start the timer.
Yes, sir. On my first word, I'm gonna take a sip of water real quick.
Yeah, go right ahead. I won't start until you start speaking.
So in today's debate, I'm going to be defending the position of infallibilism, which is the idea that you know something only if your belief could not have been wrong. And in order to support this position, right, I just get some things out of the way. Something only rises to the level of knowledge if if it can't be wrong. And some of these might be the existence of consciousness, like yourself, or the law of non-contradiction. But overall, I'll be neutral on. I think this position is neutral on the position of skepticism, of whether we have like justified true beliefs or not. And I'm going to be arguing that the main way to make sense of knowledge is through infallibilism. So one of the main reasons why I think that infallibilism is true is that of the threshold problem by Bonjour. It's basically the problem of how for fallibilism, if we conceptualize it in terms of degrees of justification for knowledge, how we can form a non-arbitrary, justification for a belief, because fallibilists believe that when we form a belief, say that there's a water bottle on my desk, they think that there is a certain amount of justification that allows me to believe that there's this water bottle on the desk. Now, the problem that Bonjour is raising here is that, well, how exactly do you go about finding out that, that alternative, like what that would be like? And Bonjour is saying that the only way you can do that is by saying it either is or it isn't the case that there like is a water bottle on the desk. And the arbitrariness of this problem makes it so they won't be able to do this. Now, you might say, can't we consider the pragmatic implications of like the desk? Like, obviously, whether there's a water bottle on my desk, we can form like a certain amount of justification for that case, versus if I have to find out like what's going to make me a rocket ship to go to Mars. Well, yeah, those will have practical implications, but not necessarily invoking on the truth. In those pragmatic situations, all that shows is that we should pay more attention to our beliefs, and that it doesn't even solve the threshold problem at all, because we're trying to find out what leads us to have knowledge, which is a justified true belief. And just saying that we have to prioritize knowledge under certain circumstance doesn't tell us on how to form a non-arbitrary conception of when a belief, given some evidence, counts as knowledge. And another thing, as a result of this threshold problem for for fallibilism is it's going to be able to deny epistemic closure. And what is that? It's basically the idea that if you have two beliefs, that from these, these normal beliefs, that you'll be able to conclude something else. Like, for example, if I have a water bottle on my desk and I know that, like, I'm about to run out of water, I have, like, a justified belief that I'll have to refill it soon if I want to get another drink. And you wouldn't be able to make these sort of deductions under fallibilism, because it would actually lead you to skepticism, because any product or any combination, like multiplication of two different probabilistic events that are under one, are always going to be less than the two individual beliefs. So fallibilism leads to skepticism by denying epistemic closure, that you can combine two different beliefs, because it's always going to end up in a lesser state of knowledge than if you were to combine them in an infallibilist framework where there is absolute states of knowledge. Either you have knowledge or you don't. And if we want to actually avoid skepticism, like my opponent might say for my position, we actually have to go with infallibilism. And another thing is, one of the biggest problems in epistemology right now, and that is the problem of Gettier cases. I think that one of the main reasons that you should prefer infallibilism is it's best able to account for Gettier cases, because because Gettier cases only are things that are basically pointing out that if we have fallibility in luck and knowledge, then there seems to be certain situations that arise that we have a justified true belief, but we don't have actually knowledge. Think of it, for example, that you're walking through the sub-Sahara desert and you see a mirage in the background. And this mirage is of water. Now, there actually is water, but the only reason that you know about that there's water is because there's a mirage, distorting that's an exact replica of the lake. Now, many epistemologists thinks that this actually isn't knowledge, right? Because you only knew about the mirage, the lake, because of lucky factors, or reasons that have to do with your fallible standpoint in the desert. Now, like, infallibilism solves this, because, like, you either know that there's a mirage or not, so you can account for these intuitions that a lot of epistemologists have regarding knowledge. And it's not exactly clear how a fallibilist would go about solving this, even though there's a bunch of different solutions. The main thing is, like, how they would form a non-arbitrary solution to this. So it seems that Gettier cases only arise as a product of fallibilism because they build fallibility and luck into the very conception of knowledge. If we didn't have those things built into knowledge, then no Gettier cases would be as a result. So, like, in conclusion, one of the main problems I've outlined is the threshold problem for fallibilism, the fact that it leads to the denial of epistemic closure, which leads to skepticism, and the ability for infallibilism to account for Gettier cases that makes them a lot more probable than fallibilism. And the threshold problem is that fallibilism can't give an account, a non-arbitrary account, for when certain amounts of evidence become knowledge in a certain state, even if it's already fallible knowledge. And given the fallibilist framework, that if we combine two states of knowledge, they're always going to be less than the given sets of knowledge, then that means we're going to be led to skepticism, because any combination of our beliefs is always going to be less than what we originally started. And the Gettier cases are able to be accounted for in my system because we either have this sort of knowledge or we don't. And one other thing is, my opponent might bring up the idea of contextualism to try and solve this threshold problem. Contextualism says that our empirical beliefs right, are justified based on our different contexts. They think that you can form a belief in a certain situation that's different in another, right? It's sort of similar to the pragmatist objection that I brought up earlier. And they probably say that you can form different things in different contexts. Well, the main objection I have to this is that it doesn't solve for the account of knowledge, because it's saying that we can justify empirical claims in certain contexts, but it basically dodges the skeptical worry of how can we account for these different premises, that they're actually, we can be justified in our beliefs and so forth. It makes no bearing on how do we deal with skeptical situations and how we're supposed to treat the truth of our empirical claims. And because it doesn't account for these things, it ultimately leads to skepticism by just avoiding all the problems in traditional epistemology. And also, it doesn't solve for the threshold problem, because even if we did get to this, magical state of knowledge, we wouldn't have, any way to tell, even if we were looking at our contexts, because you could just raise the meta question of how exactly do we, evaluate our different contexts. And for all these reasons, I think that infallibilism is the right framework of knowledge, in that in order to know something, you cannot be wrong about it. Thank you.
All right, just give me a second. And timer's been reset. So Christian, whenever you're ready, you're free to go.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to be here defending fallibilism. Now, I want to quickly give a moment to define what exactly I mean by fallibilism. Fallibilism is simply the belief that any single idea, no matter what it is, has a certain probability of being wrong, even if it's extremely slightly, only slight probability. Like, for example, it is entirely possible that we're all hallucinating this debate right this second. Now, of course, we all acknowledge that it's technically a possibility, but none of us are going to entertain the idea because it's extremely unlikely. Not because it's impossible, but because it's extremely unlikely. When we talk about fallibilism, we don't necessarily want to throw everything to skepticism, but we simply want to believe, in the face of uncertainty, which we will always be plagued with, the most likely argument. The problem with the problem with infallibilism is that it tries to essentially engage in a sort of special pleading in order to make its systems work, um, which the fallibilist will not engage in that special pleading and will simply acknowledge the flaws within all systems, not just within fallibilism or infallibilism or whatever. So, for example, my opponent, Jordan, acknowledged that fallibilism can lead to skepticism. While there are versions of fallibilism that don't really have this problem for reasons I'll get into in a minute, yes, it's true that fallibilism could lead to skepticism. And the answer to that objection is tough titties. Sometimes it's just going to lead to skepticism. The whole point of infallibilism being wrong is that skepticism has to be entertained to a certain degree. Things just can be wrong, right? But what about more fundamental claims, right? What about the idea of consciousness? Rene Descartes, I think it was Rene Descartes, put forward this idea of the cogito ergo sum, which is the idea that if I think, therefore I am. In other words, the idea that you are conscious is the most certain thing that exists in the universe, and you can be absolutely certain of this fact. It's quite a convincing argument, and I do believe that we are conscious and that consciousness exists, but I do not believe we can actually be certain of it. And that might sound very unintuitive, but you have to consider that in order to make this argument, there are certain axioms that have to be invoked here. This actually invokes the idea that we live in a logically contradictory world, because the arguments that Rene Descartes makes, and as many infallibilists make, are very logical. But the problem is that all logic rests upon axioms, and axioms themselves are arbitrary. This goes into the threshold problem that my opponent mentioned, where he essentially says that fallibilism leads to this issue where it sort of ends up being arbitrary, um, to have a justification for belief. But that's the whole point of fallibilism, is to point out that no matter what system you choose, it's always going to be arbitrary. Let's use logic for an example, right? We believe that we can logically justify that we are conscious, and that also, A equals A and the law of non-contradiction and all that sort of stuff. Okay, well, let's try to prove logic here. how do we know logic is actually true? Well, how do I do that? If I try to use logic to justify logic, that's circular reasoning, and that can't increase our confidence in any way that logic is actually true. But if I try to use any other outside system, such as say empiricism, to justify logic, then I've gone into a complete contradiction. Because if I ask what is the ultimate system of truth, there can be no outside system to verify that. Otherwise, you are using a non-absolute system of truth to verify this absolute system of truth, and you end up with a contradiction, which is worse than circular reasoning. And not only that, you end up with the problem with the criterion. The problem with the criterion is this: in order to come to any sort of idea of absolute truth, you either need a method of verifying absolute truth, or you need a particular example of absolute truth. So if I was to give you an example of like any particular idea that is absolutely true, um, you can then from there work to develop a method of how you know what is absolutely true, because you can work on how you know that absolutely true thing is absolutely true, and then develop a method from there. But that begs the question: how do you know that that one thing that you have is absolutely true if you haven't already developed the method? Well, you can't. You needed the method in order to know that that one thing is absolutely true, and you haven't got the method yet. Okay, so let's start with the method. But if you try to start with the method, you end up with a similar problem, because you don't end up ever actually touching any particular examples of truth. And this is a massively famous problem in epistemology, the ultimate conclusion being that all truth rests on axioms. Axioms are things we choose. We can be wrong in what we choose about our axioms. Therefore, all knowledge is fallible. And another problem with knowledge is that any claims to absolute truth end up with an infinite regress problem. If you want to say that logic is absolutely true, then we end up with a couple of infinite regress problems. For example, let's say you have classic modus ponens. I have an argument that says premise one, P, if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Now, that argument is a classic, very simple argument made with logic throughout the centuries. However, it ends up with this one problem. It assumes that there's actually a connection. There's an implicit argument that's not being shown in the syllogism, which is that there's a connection between P and Q. Okay, so they will include that in the syllogism. Oh, but in order for that argument to be true, there has to be a connection between that argument that there's a connection and the connection itself. So then you have to have another syllogism. And eventually what you end up is with this infinite regress. In other words, in order to make logic work, you have to deal with a certain infinite regress of arguments. Like, so you can sort of take any argument and divide it indivisibly forever, basically. So if I argue 2 + 2 = 4, it's like, well, how do you know that? I give my argument. And then we take that argument I give, and it's like, well, how do you know that? Well, how do you know that? Well, how do you know? It keeps going with this infinite regress. And if there's anything that we can't have actual 100% knowledge of, it's infinity. Infinity is so beyond our epistemological reach that we can never actually know if it even exists, because it leads to a lot of contradictions. There's no way we could ever verify anything infinite. And empiricism has this problem too. So anytime you view something, right, you say, I see a water bottle on my desk, therefore it exists. Okay, but you have to assume that you're not hallucinating and provide an argument that you're not hallucinating. Okay, but once you provided the argument that you're not hallucinating, that argument could be wrong. So you're going to have to give an argument for that, and you still end up with this infinite regress problem. Now, any criticisms that then get turned on fallibilism, where it's like, for example, if we turn to fallibilism, we lead to skepticism, and we can't deal with giddy cases. Well, all you're doing is just pointing out that fallibilism has a chance to, like, it has a problem with giving us absolute truth, right? Fallibilism is going to have a very difficult problem in giving absolute truth. Exactly. That's the point of fallibilism, is that no system can give you absolute truth. It would be contradictory if we actually succeeded in these problems that my opponent was pointing out. There's also the issue of, for example, sorry, let me just check my notes here. So I want to sort of come back to a couple of things my opponent says, where it says he sort of in many of the examples that he invoked with the Gideon problems, or in the example of the sorry, what is it? I need to check my notes again. Sorry, the threshold problem. Both of those arguments, right, depend on logic in order to be correct. They're very logical arguments, but suppose I have a problem with logic, or I have a different system of logic, which doesn't include the law of excluded middle, for example. Well, you can only say I'm wrong from the perspective of your framework, which would be begging the question. But then anyone who argues with you also has that problem of only being able to say that you're wrong from their perspective, and they're thus begging the question. There's no system that can escape this. The moment you invoke a system, you can only argue from the perspective of that system, and that system will always beg the question. There is no escape for this, which is why the only solution is to acknowledge that this is the case, acknowledge that we can be wrong in our axioms, and be fallibilists. Now, with these examples, also like with the Gettier cases, for example, we see a mirage in the desert, and the only way that we could know about of the mirage if we've already had an experience of water. That's a very logical argument, but it invokes the axiom of induction, or the principle of induction, which wasn't even discussed, right? It assumes that just because you have an experience of water in the past, that there must be water existing somewhere in the universe. Well, how do you know there's a uniformity to nature? For all you know, all other examples of water in the universe have instantly evaporated and disappeared, and there's no water in the entirety of the universe since the last time you checked. Now, of course, that sounds ridiculous, and it's extremely unlikely that it happened. Yes, extremely unlikely, but never impossible. That's the thing. The problem with the infallibilist position is that it's too lofty and it makes too many claims. It sets the bar for itself way too high, because it not only argues that its arguments are correct, but that we could have 100% certainty that they are correct. If we can be wrong about our arguments in ways that we're not even cognitively capable of processing. There may be some sort of fourth dimensional sort of logic that we're not even capable of understanding as a species that can sort of prove why we're wrong, which is kind of redundant, because many philosophers have already proven that we're wrong, from David Hume, in terms of our being infallible anyway, from David Hume to basically anyone who points out that we each have to invoke our systems. And I guess I'll just yield my time there.
All right. So I'll get it set up. And now we got our open discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and start the timer, and you guys can start. And again, before you do, to remind everybody that's just come in, we have a new setup for our questions. Looks like the help is actually in the side chat, so I guess I don't really need to say anything. Thank you again, Whodunit, for setting that up. Makes it easier. Yeah, so just use the information that's on there and put your questions in, and at the end, I will be asking the debaters the questions. So other than that, I'm going to go and get the timer started, and you guys are free to start your open discussion.
Would you like to ask first, Christian Anarchist, or should I go first?
Well, I guess I do have a question I'd like to ask you, right?
Sure, go
Um,
for it.
So a lot of your arguments that you use, for example, like the Mirage argument or the Gettier cases, a lot of that invokes the principle of induction. And David Hume points out that the problem of induction, that induction is not necessarily justified because it's not very empirical. It's an axiom invoked in order to make sense of empiricism. And so I just have to ask the question, how do you have 100% certainty in induction without begging the question?
Well, I don't think that, like for most knowledge claims, that you can have, I don't think most we know a lot less than we do. And for the principle of induction, I think a solid way that we could, counter it is that in order for us to like even make arguments, that our premises have to follow from premises to conclusion. So it's already ingrained within the structure of logic in general. And I think like coherentism is a good framework for infallibilism, which says all of our beliefs are connected. So by the very framework of logic, it sort of leads to the principle of induction in general. Do you mind if I ask you a question?
Oh, sorry, is my mic cut out? Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Sorry.
Well, regarding the Gettier cases, I was my essential intuition was wondering how like the fallibilists would be able to account for it. You said that, oh well, it's exactly the point that we we have some sort of skepticism in our system. But how exactly does that account for like Gettier cases? Because I think the main intuition is even assuming that, like on the fallibilist case, that there's going to be some sort of hidden intuition regarding the mirage that's not going to lead them to knowledge. So how exactly are you solving for that?
Well, because in those Gettier cases, you're still invoking a system, right? You're saying that because you see the mirage, we can deduce logically from that principle that there must have been some experience of water somewhere. It has to exist somewhere, right? In order for it to be a hallucination that can even affect your mind and give you the association, that sort of thing. Now, that's a very logical argument and empirical. But what if I was to say, I think that empiricism and logic are fundamentally nonsense, and I don't agree with them, and you can only make this argument downstream logic and empiricism. So what justifies logic and empiricism then?
Well, I think that, just like Manuel Kant and Fichte and the Wittgenstein, we can prove logic as something that's a precondition for experience and argumentation in the first place, sort of thing. Or in Wittgenstein puts on certainty that in order to make sense of language, communication, there has to be certain rules that take place in order for meaning to even make sense and for us to communicate. So by the very fact of communication, there are already inbuilt rules within us that say that, oh, we're talking to each other. Even if we were stuck in a Cartesian demon situation, right? These things still wouldn't. It would still would apply. There would still have to be certain rules regarding the structure of our minds and how things work. Because I've noticed, just speaking in generally about most skeptical objections, is that they presuppose the subject-object distinction haphazardly without being critical of it. And I think I'd be saying that in order to be able to make sense of the skeptical objection, oh, what if there's these deceptions? You have to presuppose that there is a subject and an object that you're appealing to in order to even make that claim in the first place. So that's like an unexamined assumption on the skeptic's part. So, and I think that we can know, at least infallibly, that there is a subject. So, yeah, I think
Well,
you could
well,
prove it by through a transcendental argument.
Well, see, that's begging the question, isn't it? You're sort of saying, like, you gave me an example, like language. That's a particular thing we verified by our systems of epistemology. We've verified that we can talk through logic, and like logic tells us that we can talk and communicate with one another. And empiricism says the same thing. But we still haven't solved the problem of how we can trust those systems. Sure, you can say that, like for example, like you got to remember these skeptics that are supposedly invoking this subject-object distinction. These skeptics are merely providing an internal critique. They're using the logic provided by your system and using it to destroy itself because it is a self-destroying argument. They don't. That's kind of like the classic presuppositionalist defense. It's like, well, in order to say, if we apply this to discussions of God, for example, when I talk to presuppositionalists, they say, well, in order to disprove God, you have to invoke the concept of God. Yeah, of course, it's an internal critique, right? So you kind of have to uh, you know, if we're going to assume certain arguments for the sake of the point, in order to in order to provide an argument that your argument is self-contradictory, we have to begin with one premise you agree with, and then show how it conflicts with another premise you agree with. So that's the only reason why it might appear that they're begging the question. They're not.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. Not all premises have to be represented in the form of a proposition. Like they certainly can, but as Fichte allowed us to know, that it can also be represented as an act, like an act of existing. The act of being conscious is itself a way to know things. Like knowledge how, for instance, that's where all the qualia stuff comes from, that we can know that we have certain experiences, is that there is not just the propositional knowledge, that there's this knowledge how that allows us to experience certain states of affairs and knowledge. And if the skeptic's going to be internally critiquing my system, they've already bought into logic, they've already bought into you know um, the self existing, in which case there would be no further debate, right? Because at least we know things infallibly then now. um
Well, no, because even if they bought into your argument, they could still have doubts about your argument, right? Like even if at the end of this debate right now, I ended up being convinced of being a fallibilist, right? How do I know that all of these arguments you keep invoking for fallibilism, oh, sorry, infallibilism, I mixed that up, sorry. Um, how do I know that those arguments are true? Like, because that's the thing, but the infallibilist arguments, it's not just enough for your arguments to maybe be true from a certain perspective where I could kind of see it, it has to be so ontologically certain that it justifies ontological certainty itself, which you haven't demonstrated that there's no possible way. Like, this is what I mean. Like, because you've set the burden of proof so high just by being an infallibilist, you would essentially have to verify an infinite amount of knowledge. You would have to look at all of knowledge itself and take a bigger look at it at your microscope and examine it, and then verify that there's absolutely no way that in any truth states that any of your arguments could never be wrong, which you may very well be likely true, right? I might be able to be convinced that maybe there's a 90% chance that you're right, but that can never be infallible, right? There's always that like, even if you were 99.9999% right on a particular argument, there's always that slither of a chance, right? It's the same thing with the cogito. I'm convinced by the cogito that we are conscious, but I don't have certainty in it because, again, I can be wrong in ways I haven't even conceived of. Or it could just be that logic itself is false and you can have hallucinations while not existing. In fact, maybe you could invoke some principle where time is relative itself. So maybe you've been thrown into a black hole. So from one perspective of a time frame, you've been destroyed, you don't exist. But relative to another time frame, you're still experiencing the universe go by. So that's actually a natural way in which you can have conscious experience and still not exist, as counterintuitive as it may seem.
Wait, how would that be the case? Just because you switch time, how does that say that you're not conscious?
Well, again, like it would invoke a lot of general relativity and everything like that. And obviously, I don't actually think that this is the case, right? I'm making the point that there is like a small enough slither of possibility. Like, even if it was so utterly minuscule that it's just a rounding error, it still exists. That, like, it's not just that you're arguing that your argument is the best possible alternative, right? It's that it's 100% correct, right? When I say that I'm a fallibilist, I look at all the arguments that are presented to me and I just pick the one which is most likely to be correct. That's how I handle things in the face of uncertainty. But you can't
Well,
do that as an infallibilist. You have to
well,
have 100% certainty, which doesn't
yeah, I'm
work
asking
without.
even under like the minuscule like circumstance of like quantum mechanics or whatever. Like what would that even look like? Because even to assert that is to give a certain proposition. No one should, if there's even like, say like there's a case where we actually don't exist, then there is no reason to take that argument seriously. I mean,
Well, it doesn't
like
matter
I,
whether
I
you
just
take the
I
argument
don't see
seriously or not. Well, it doesn't matter if you take the argument seriously or not. It just matters whether or not it's true. That's the thing. You're presupposing this idea that what is true has to be able to make sense to us, when even just that is like blatantly on its face wrong. It's not just that it's unlikely, that I might have confidence in it. It's just that that is actually itself wrong. Quantum mechanics itself originally seemed to put forward logical contradictions itself that seem to violate the very laws of logic themselves. Now, to the extent that I agree that that's the case, I wouldn't personally say that that's the case, but there's a chance that that's very well true, and that we live in a logically incoherent universe. So you would have to be able to provide, in order for you to be correct, you would have to provide to me an argument why we live in a why we live in a logically coherent universe, but you would also have to do it without invoking logic, because otherwise it's just circular reasoning. And I guess we haven't heard that yet. So what is the non-system dependent argument for why we should have this system?
I'll answer that, but first I want to give like one clarification. Like, even if we're like invoking the problem of the criteria, right? Like, if you read Robert Chisholm's original paper, fallibilism really isn't like a solution to this either way, because you still have like standards of knowledge, even in a fallible sense, that you still have to, like, how do I know that I have like a criteria? And there's like, throughout the ages you had like more or like David Hume, according to Chisholm, was a Methodist, which is like basically coherentism, basically. But like, the point is that, like, even if if the problem of the criteria is somehow like a big problem, like, it's still a problem for both of us. So I think it's non-unique. But also, like, also, I think that we can choose the the coherentist solution, that we do have like a method, because in the paper Chisholm presented the problem, the criteria that's most influential. Skepticism itself, throughout, is just another options. Chisholm says, and we have no reason to prefer the skeptical option. And because with all of our existing beliefs, we have good reason to accept the coherentist. Although that we're going to rely on our system, we still have no like reason to choose the skeptic. And because of that, we can implement that it's not a defeater in the first place, for us to have knowledge like of all these different things.
Well, yeah, it's a
So
problem. Yeah,
so like
it's
go
sorry,
ahead.
go on. No, it's all right. You go. You go.
Okay, cool. Well, and I think that by if Immanuel Kant, through the Critique of Pure Reason, I think showed that there are certain things that we can deduce synthetically a priori about if we have the self, that we have to invoke the idea of the external world in order for the possibility of the possibility of error in the first place, right? Because in order to even be in doubt, in order to even doubt, a certain proposition, there has to be a difference between me and you, or the difference between the universe and me, because otherwise it would collapse into subjective idealism and everything would be right for me. So in order to even have a probabilistic, state for quantum mechanics to show the self is logically incoherent, maybe that's the case, but the fact that but there has to be some notion of the self-positing ficta I, in order to even make sense of the notion of error itself, because that presupposes that there is something called error in the first place, in which we can grasp.
Okay, so let's say to address the idea that there needs to be the subject itself. Let's go into that. Now, I'm going to, for the sake of this argument, pretend to believe in three value logic. I believe that there can be some ideas which are themselves self-contradictory and yet true. As part of my logic system, I exclude the law of non-contradiction, which means I believe that you can be in error and still not exist as a consciousness. What argument would you use to prove with certainty that I'm wrong?
Well, can we specify three value logic? Because there's stuff where there's indefiniteness, versus true and false, and then there's I guess other three value logic. It's like true and false, some stuff Graham Priest has. Um, or are you just talking general?
So yeah, when I say three value logic, I mean that in any proposition given, any statement is either true, false, or both true and false. I believe that there are such things as true and false. Now, you might say that's logically contradictory, but I want an argument as to why.
Well, the reason those things get off the ground is because they deny something called the principle of explosion, which says that if there's a contradiction, then all things are true. Well, even in those systems, those logics, most pair consistent logicians only they come out and say, like J.C. Beale in his book on dialetheism, that it's only mainly a semantic thesis, that it's only to apply to things like the Sorites paradox or the liar's paradox, and these things don't actually really get into the notion of the self or anything like that. So I don't think that has anything to do with metaphysics or what we're talking about with epistemology, right? So
Well, we're not even invoking categories such as metaphysics. We're not even ready to talk about that yet. I just want to know, why am I wrong to believe in that third value of logic? You've said that other philosophers have talked about it, but they could all just be wrong, or wrong and right at the same time. I don't really care what they have to say. I want to hear why it's impossible. Not just that there's problems with it. I want to know why it's impossible for me to be right.
that there is as a semantic thesis, or as an actual metaphysical thesis, because there's a difference between those two as being a contradiction. Like,
Let's say that there's not. Again, if we're invoking three value logic, it's entirely possible that they're both the same thing, or they're both the same thing and different at the same time.
Okay, well, I mean, like in that case, like I think you could actually just like concede that even if there was like contradictions, there'd still be no like a notion of the self, like some point of like the self in order to like in a irrational universe, because just because you're like I guess irrational doesn't mean you don't exist, and like even the self would exist in that, right? Like there's still like an irrational universe there, which
Well, what if
exists.
the self both exists and doesn't exist at all?
I mean
Would you
then
grant that?
that I mean like if even then that would be like exists and it doesn't exist. I guess that would still be a point of knowledge, right?
But it doesn't exist.
But like I guess it does exist.
But it also doesn't exist.
But even so, right? Like I think you could still defend it that it's needed for like the very idea of like rational discourse. That
Well,
we
what
don't
makes you
hold
think?
to like contradictory and
Well, who cares about whether not discourse is rational if that's the thing in question, right? I'm arguing that it's entirely possible rational discourse may be meaningless and not refer to any truth whatsoever. But you're saying, well, in order to have that rational discourse, we need to invoke certain things. And yeah, that's my argument. It's like, well, we need to keep doing this just to get the conversation off the ground. That's the very thing in question. Who's to say we should be even having this conversation right now? You know what I mean? Not to say that I'm not grateful, and I am grateful that Batman is a sorted this out and everything. But what I'm trying to say is you keep begging the question. It keeps invoking certain axioms. Like implicit in every single argument you've given is this idea that we should trust logic, and not just logic, but your specific system of logic. And I just keep wondering, well, what's the justification for that? We haven't heard that yet. And
well,
I believe that the answer is, sorry, go on. Yeah.
I think like a lot of like what a lot like Lawrence Bonjour or like a bunch of epistemologists would say is that logic is, I guess, self-critical of itself. It examines its own assumptions, or another way to put this is that it's non-inferential justification, right? Just because I don't another belief, that doesn't mean I'm not giving a justification, right? Because if I'm saying like I know logic because I'm using logic for standards of discourse, that's just pointing out to my other beliefs in order to support my second order beliefs, and that's a perfectly coherent form of justification, right? Um,
Well, again, I don't care whether it's coherent. You're invoking coherence, but the very idea of coherence itself is in question. I agree with you. Like, listen, on a personal level, you got me convinced. In terms of wanting to be coherent, right? I do want to be a coherent sort of person, but you know, it doesn't mean that coherence itself can just be granted just because we really want it to. It doesn't matter. Like if we just live in a logically, if we're trying to have a logical conversation in an illogical universe, then this whole project fails. And unless you can prove without the slightest shadow of, like on an ontological level, it's not enough to just convince the people in this debate. It's not enough to. You got to convince the. No, it's not even just. Well, it's not necessarily a question of convincing, but it's a matter of proving the ability to prove. Like again, you haven't dealt with the circularity. It's an inescapable problem. I
well,
just, yeah, a better solution would be to acknowledge it. Yes, it's a problem. We have axioms, but let's get on with it. Let's do some philosophy. Let's acknowledge that we have this slight problem, but let's look at the most likely answer to be true. All right, that's what we do for everything. Even that's another thing with epistemology. We often talk about it trying to provide certainty, but that's not really the job of epistemology. The job of epistemology is when we're dealt with a problem. The whole point of a philosophical problem is that there is uncertainty, and epistemology allows us to navigate uncertainty. Navigating uncertainty and the very existence of our lack of infallible knowledge is the point of epistemology.
well, here's the thing, though, right? I agree that there are like certain states of that you can be like not sure about things, like you can form conditionals and knowledge, and that's like how I think we can navigate for the majority of other beliefs that we might think are uncertain in some cases, because they'd still be absolutely true if the conditionals hold. But like just saying that, like I'm appealing to coherence in order to justify coherence. Well, I mean, like why would that be a bad thing, right? Like that's I think that I'm being skeptical of skepticism itself, you know. In that
Well, you
way,
can't.
it's providing a positive thesis. And there isn't really, because like what I said earlier, in order to justify the notion of error, there has to be some sort of basis that you have to like found that on. That, like, I know you're questioning the very idea of coherence, and I'm giving you, like, I guess, a circular answer, but at like this meta level, like, why is that a bad thing? Like that, it's not a vicious circularity, it's a virtuous type of circularity.
Well, now you've invoked sort of moral phrasing into it, which makes it even more uncertain. But let's to put that aside, right? I don't actually think that it's such a massive problem. I just think it's a slight problem, enough of a problem to be 0.0000001% of a problem, right? Enough to give us the slightest bit of uncertainty in every single thing that we believe in, especially because you're not being, if you allow circularity at this level, then you can't be consistent. I would argue that if truth exists, it's consistent truth. And if you can't be consistent in your system that which you use to verify truth, then it could never map onto a consistent truth, right? So if you, for example, allow circularity with your axioms of logic, well then you're missing the point that there's alternative systems. What about a pure empiricist? There's lots of logical positivists that exist are in the world today, and it's a failed uh, a system, but it's only a failed system from the perspective that we care about logic, or we care about the primacy of logic. That, like, when you say, "Well, I'm just evoking a circularity to justify a system," what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that you can do the exact same method to justify alternative systems, which have extremely different conclusions than yours, and yet have the same level of viability, um, inherently, anyway. Maybe not from your perspective,
Well, like,
but
I mean, even from other positions, right? Like for you point out the logical positivists, and the reason that one of the biggest arguments, like, after Ayer, and Carnap with the verification principle. We don't have to get into details, but it's basically, anything is like metaphysical, not metaphysical, but like they didn't believe mostly in metaphysics that anything that's meaningful is empirically verifiable, basically. And the reason why they failed was that they didn't live up to their own standards, right? Uh, I think that, like, when we're talking about meta beliefs, that if it's false, then they will like fail on their own grounds for one reason or another. In the case of the logical positivists, because they claim that anything that's only meaningful to empirically verifiable, but by their own criteria, the verifiability criteria was not itself verifiable, as they later like conceded. And there's a bunch of debate, like with Carnap and the later logical positivists, but they ultimately, like, it fell out of fashion for that very reason, because they were inconsistent on their own grounds. So I think that we can apply that sort of methodology when looking at the global sphere of our beliefs. Um, they're going to be internally inconsistent for
well,
the
that's what
false.
I'm arguing. That's what I'm arguing is the problem of, like, basically every system, right? Um, that, like, even like if you allow circular reasoning and unjustified positions at the beginning of your epistemology, so you just believe in logic and you don't try to justify a belief in logic, you just claim that it's true. Okay, fine, but what's stopping you from doing the inverse? Or which system of logic do you claim? It does, like, and when you say, like, oh well, you have all these competing systems, right? Well, how do you know that you've gone out there and verified every single system that exists and seen that it's correct or incorrect? And once, even if you've managed to do that, which would take you an infinite amount of time, therefore you cannot do it, therefore you can not have certainty on it. Even if you did do it, you could only be able to do it from the perspective of your system. So you would need a system to determine whether each of these systems you're going out and verifying. You need a system to determine the correctness of systems. But what determines the correctness of that system? And you could see the infinite regress going the other way. Look, the point is that you cannot have certainty about infinity, and every single truth claim of like 100% certainty is going to invoke an infinite, essentially, amount of certainty, an infinite amount of verification and verifiability, and that is going to be a problem. and sure, you could try to turn the only way, right, to try to save this project is to look at to sort of try to point that on the fallibilist and say, well, what about you? Like, it seems as though the only way you could defend infallibilism is by criticizing other systems rather than justifying your own system.
Well, I'll respond with two things. For one, if we needed an infinite amount of things to justify like an argument at all, then like that would apply to that argument, and like then we wouldn't. Then your very skeptical raise wouldn't be able to be coherent, as in like any sort of skeptical objection in the first place, right? And the second thing, you raised the question of like how can I go through like an infinite amount of systems, right? I don't think that we actually have to. We can only look at a certain set of beliefs, which since Aristotle and many others, people have like thought of as like transcendental categories of of metaphysics and or you can logic or whatever if you like for Husserl or whatever, you know. And by looking at like these very like limited amount of things, things like modality, but like the self, like reality, like these basic principles that you can basically evaluate these principles, and that will determine the rest of our system. And I'd like just to make a quick remark and say that if you hold one principle to be true, our beliefs impact our other beliefs. Like, for example, if one believes that God exists, that's going to influence if their thoughts on morality are going to look like. It's going to influence. It's going to influence a variety of other things, like how they treat metaphysics, right? So, by looking at these basic principles, it's going to form the rest of our beliefs. So we don't need an infinite amount of time to examine everything. So like essentially, like not only I think is the first critique kind of like self-refuting, but we actually can look at like the coherence and the internal structure of other worldviews.
So not only would I fundamentally disagree that it's self-refuting, because that's the whole point of fallibilism, is that when you look at those infinite regresses, you say, well, we're not going to bother trying to be certain about these infinite regresses. We're just going to go with what is the most likely answer. Again, I don't see how that's has the same problem. You just acknowledge that there's a certain uncertainty there because of that infinite regress. It's just being honest there. Second of all, um, there was a second thing. Oh, like so you said that you don't actually need to infinite amount of time to verify all these systems, and then you just invoked Aristotle, my brother in Christ. That's a system, and I'm not Aristotelian. I have a similar metaphysics to Aristotle, but I am definitely not Aristotelian. Why should I care about what Aristotle wrote? He's using a system. Aristotelian is a system that you've gone and you're trying to use Aristotle, and that's literally what I said. Okay, if we had a system to verify other system, what justifies that system? How can we scrutinize that system? And you just invoked Aristotle and his categories to view other systems. Well, let me tell you, that he's not even very well respected in a lot of modern philosophy, especially because his some of his categories have problems that even I would acknowledge. And so, like, why Aristotle and not Plato? He had a system for verifying these categories. Well, okay, let's have an argument between Aristotle and Plato. Who decides whether they're right? Again, problem of the criterion. If you require this arbitrator, this system we're trying to invoke to determine the correctness of systems, we would require an infinite sort of like, chain of like arbitration where you just sort of like, yeah, you have to stop at a certain point and say, look, we're never going to be certain about this. We're never going to resolve the issue of the uncertainty that plagues everything. But you just have to sort of accept it as a fact of life and just sort of make the arguments anyway, because a lot of the arguments that infallibilists make are likely to be true, but can never like uh verify, because you can never verify anything that's infinite.
I like to like resolve like certain like ambiguity. When I was bringing up Aristotle, I was just giving like a historical like argument, like people throughout history of philosophy, even up into today, like with Frege's categories. Like I'm just showing that we just have a limited amount of assumptions that like starting points that we can begin with. at the base root of when we're starting philosophy. And these base root assumptions will determine the rest of our beliefs, which is what I get with God example. I'm not necessarily saying that Aristotle is right in all cases, right? All I'm just saying is that we have these limited assumptions that will that we've seen historically play out, that certain presuppositions will lead to other presuppositions that one may have, right? It's why you get the disagreement in the first place, when you resolve with the problem, the criteria, that people seem to have differing systems, that they come to different points off. Like, people believe in God and they believe in this absolute morality, and some atheists like John Mackey might think that it's absurd, because they hold to entirely different starting points to how they do that, right? And in the problem, the criteria, as I've already said before, it's still a problem for both of us, like whether we're doing a fallibilist epistemology or an infallibilist epistemology. So it's ultimately non-unique, for me, right? And also, we can still look at the internal coherence of these alternate systems, and you might say, why should we prefer the internal foundationalism to coherentism, or things along those manner. But I think we can do these sort of internal critiques, and something will emerge from that. And I think that's coherentism, at the fundamental level of epistemology and philosophy, especially accounting for error. And the most fundamental thing is the self that arises from that.
So you seem to acknowledge that we do have starting points that we have to sort of starting basic assumptions that we have to grant in order to engage in philosophy, and people can have different starting assumptions. Well, that seems to be my argument, right? Because I would just then ask, first of all, well, then what's the correct starting points, and what starting points are you invoking to say that there's a correct starting point? Second of all, when you say the problem of criteria is equally a problem for me as for you, it's not, because you're the one who's invoking a much bigger argument. You're not, the whole point of the problem of criteria is to point out the problem of ever having absolute truth. The Fallibilist project is not to reach for absolute truth. So it's a problem exclusively for you, who is trying to say we have absolute truth. I'm not trying to say we have absolute truth. And so that's why it's not nearly as, even if it was somewhat of a problem for me, it's not nearly as much as the person who has a greater burden of proof. You're making the greater claim here. You're saying that there is this absolute truth that we could have. Pretty much every example you've provided, I've pointed out, well, that makes certain assumptions, and you've not even a single time verified those assumptions. I mean, I don't want to be. I sound a bit rude almost, but like you say, for example, the self is a fundamental starting point. I don't think the self is a fundamental starting point. I would have to make an argument that the self exists from my epistemology and from my metaphysics. I start with a metaphysics of substance, and the self rises out of a substance existing, right? Because what the self is some sort of substance, right? We're made of stuff. We exist as something that is composite of other things. We don't just exist as the primacy of the universe. We don't create the universe with our own minds. Although that's what your epistemology almost seems to be suggesting, and that's what people from the Kantian perspective have uh, you know, put forward, the idea that we create ourselves, we create our own universe, we create our own minds, right? This is what happens when you try to grant absolute certainty and primacy to these claims, is that you end up with ridiculous positions anyway. So I guess I still have to know, you know, yeah, it just doesn't escape the problem, and you're the
Well,
one who has the greater problem with the greater burden of proof.
yeah, well, I think that we're both the problem with critique is still a problem for both of us. Although I'm making a claim about that you have to be absolutely know something for knowledge, that doesn't say whether we have knowledge or not. And but also the main thing is that even if you saying that you're allowing some skepticism and saying that oh, I can be fallible about these things, I put for the threshold problem, that'd be an example of the problem, the criteria coming back with a vengeance. Because even if you had some sort of claim, right, that you say, oh, well, like I believe that there's a water bottle on my desk, you could still have to ask, like, where would be a non-arbitrary account for like why that would be? Say if it's 20% evidence, 40% probabilistic chance, right? That's still like trying to find out like what's the right criteria for knowledge, and I don't see a way for fallibilism to get out of that without appealing to absolute standards, and also and like we've not really talked it about, but much, but also the epistemic closure thing, that it seems to be that if we're looking at the problem, the criteria, and you're trying to deduce two states of knowledge, anything less than one, if you multiply them together, will be less than the original two things that you started with. So it seems like you're gonna be in a worse off position, even if you claim that fallibilism is true, that we can be fallible about our beliefs, right? That itself is a claim, right? Even if you have to prove it with probability, you still have to demonstrate that state of knowledge, even if it's only probable.
Well, first of all, right, like I said with the criteria, you say, well, fallibilism is just as arbitrary as all other systems. You got to realize that's the claim we're making. That's the basis of our fallibilism, is that yes, the system is arbitrary. That's the problem. You can't escape that. I can't escape that. No one can escape that. Henceforth, we are fallibilists. That's the whole point. Like you keep pointing to evidence for fallibilism as like a problem for fallibilism. I just don't see what the issue is here. And second of all, my claim that even if it was probable that fallibilism is true, seems to be justified by the fact that I've pointed out these infinite regress problems, the problem of the criterion applying especially to you, the fact that you have a greater burden of proof because you're claiming 100% certainty, which you haven't demonstrated. You're asking me to demonstrate something I believe I have, and yet you haven't even demonstrated once your whole argument. So, like, even though you have the greater burden of proof, I've actually shouldered the burden of proof I haven't needed to. I've like, even if I was to grant I do need to demonstrate it, I have, because in all of logic, there's an infinite regress problem, and with epistemology, and there's the problem of axioms, and there's the problem of the criterion. There's so many examples of philosophical issues I could bring up for why 100% certainty just isn't going to cut the mustard, unless I was the only way that I could ever grant you 100% certainty if I was tricked into just letting you do the special pleading for saying, oh, well, just give me these axioms. If we just start with these axioms, we can see how it's certain from these perspectives. Like, grant me the self, grant me the idea that I am the self. Just grant me this narrative. Just grant me this story. No, I'm not going to. That's the whole point. If I shouldn't have to either, if it's 100% certain, you shouldn't have to make these appeals to these. Just grant me this position. It should just be 100% certainty in the face of it, no questions asked.
Yeah, I think you're right. And like the reason why we're doing that is that we're saying that like we're appealing to, I guess, like, transcendental arguments in order to like justify the self, that it's needed for the very idea of intelligibility, or even logical consistency, or whatever, that we need to even in order to doubt in the first place. And if we're not doubting, then we're still in a state of believing in the claim. And like with the infinite regress, the problem, the criteria, I think they're both like on the same theme of skepticism. I think that fallibilism doesn't solve for it, because otherwise, why wouldn't you just go in like the straight Pyrrhonian skepticism that says that we have to suspend judgment about all claims? Instead, that seems more like a Humean skepticism that says that we can only know things like fallibly, instead of like the more radical Pyrrhonists, skeptics. So I think that even if you're a fallibilist, you still have some presuppositions regarding how probability works and how that applies to beliefs, and what that entails for, like you said, that if you do have an infinite regress, that you can't justify your system. But that itself is, like a presupposition that you're bringing to the table, that isn't avoiding the infinite regress argument itself. Um, and I think that if one were to be consistent, they would lead them to the Pyrrhonian skeptic position, that that's not necessarily entailed by fallibilism, because they could be like a Humean skeptic, or like most modern epistemologists who aren't Pyrrhonists.
Well, first of all, we could just, like you said, like the fact that I have axioms is not something I deny. It's something I, wear on my sleeve. That's like the whole point of fallibilism. Again, I do have axioms that, like, about what is more likely to be probable and things like that. And I have this sort also implicit in all of my system that I have is this sort of epistemic prescriptivism. I believe we should be right about knowledge as much as we can be, if such a thing is even possible. I engage with this sort of epistemic prescriptivism, hence why I go for the most likely answer. Now, could I be wrong about any of this? Of course I can. That's the point. I keep trying to do this deflection. Every time I try to ask you to lift this hefty burden of proof, you deflect to, well, it's a problem for you too. Exactly. That's my point. That's the argument I'm making. You can't just keep going back to this. Like, and not only that, the specific problem I have is the axioms, not the infinite regress problem. So all systems seem to have problems. My problems just seem to be less than your problems because I make less lofty claims about infinite knowledge. I don't claim to be able to provide such a thing. If you can provide such a thing, provide it, but also stand up to the fact that you're invoking axioms to make it work, and that's therefore it can't work. I just don't see how we could possibly ever escape this.
Well, I guess like what I've been trying to say is that like not that we can know everything for certain. Like I just um right? Like,
One
if it's
thing,
knowledge
even just
for
one thing.
knowledge has to be like absolutely certain. But for conditional claims that we can be justified, but it's not doesn't count as knowledge. Like you can have rational certainty, as in like it doesn't rise to the level of knowledge, but it's like a justified opinion or whatever. Sort of like what like inductive claims might be like. Um, but ultimately, when we look at these fundamental things like the self, that they are justified by the very fact that we can make sense of error. I'm basically making that argument that the self needs to be in place, that for these axioms or basically first principles need to be in place in order to make sense of the concept of error in the first place. And that's like, I guess, like transcendental argument. Um, and that is providing an absolute proof for this. Uh, and also, um, yeah, I don't see how, like, yeah, infallibilism is saying that, you know, we do have, like, we are absolutely certain in our beliefs, but still it has the infinite regress problem, um, like in the form of the threshold problem. So ultimately, even if you have these certain presuppositions, they still have to be justified and why they wouldn't entail Peronism, essentially. So I think because of these reasons, infallibilism is true.
All right. So we've reached the time. Do you guys feel like you need to go for another 5 or 10 more minutes, or do you want to go straight to questions?
I think we can go to questions.
Sounds
All
good.
right. I'll just give me 1 sec. And that was queued up. Boom. There we go. All right. So we have 5 questions. Not very many, but that's fine. So the first one is for Jordan by Foxes. I think I'm still saying that right. I'm not sure. How do you define what distinctions do you draw between data, information, knowledge, and understanding?
Is that for Christian Anarchist or me? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Jordan. For Jordan.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. Give me a sec. How do you define what distinctions do you draw between data, information, knowledge, and understanding?
I'm defining. I don't know how exactly to define all those terms, but in this case, I'm defining knowledge as belief. I guess you can say, if you mean understanding, is that you're able to comprehend something? It's like it's a meaningful proposition or state of knowledge. How, as like that'd be a form of understanding. what were the other definitions? It's data.
Data, information, knowledge, and understanding. Define what distinctions do you draw between those?
Data is like facts or statistics, that we have for reference or analysis or something. And I gave one for knowledge, understanding. What was the last one?
Information and data.
Information is a very there's a lot of different definitions, especially in the philosophy of information, but just like facts that are provided that we learn about something. And like data is just statistics and like reference about something. You might look at it between like quantities of characters, symbols, or something about something.
All right. We have one for Anarchist by Intellector. If I even said that right. Isn't fallibilism self-defeating? If fallibilism holds that all of our beliefs could be false, does that include the belief of fallibilism itself? If it does, then how can we ever trust in the validity of fallibilism? If it doesn't, isn't that contradictory?
So that's to confuse fallibilism with like just regular skepticism, which isn't what fallibilism is, right? When we say that all beliefs could be wrong, that doesn't mean they are. You don't just go from that they could be wrong to that they definitely are wrong, or that they definitely should be distrusted. Acknowledging that they could be wrong does not necessarily mean and you must distrust it. That's the skeptics. That's what the skeptics make. It's hard to say. Sorry. That just because something can be wrong doesn't mean you should believe that it's wrong, right? Like even the infallibilist would invoke that argument where it's like, oh, sure, we might not have certainty about this right now, but there's certain things which we can know without being certain, in the sense that we can have a pretty good idea. Maybe we just need to update our information later. So there's beliefs that are like that in all systems, right? Especially because Jordan even says that not all beliefs are infallible, just some of them. So from the infallibilist perspective, what beliefs are fallible? Well, the same standard you would apply to that, just apply to all beliefs. That's simple. And fallibilism is not self-refuting; it's self-supporting. The idea that fallibilism itself can be wrong, but is unlikely to be wrong, is itself what supports the. It's actually a self-supporting, which is circular, but all systems are circular, and that's the whole point of fallibilism.
All right. I have another one from Intellector. It's for Anarchist again. If all knowledge is fallible, how do you justify trust in your cognitive faculties and sensory perception? Aren't you assuming some level of infallibility in your cognition to even argue for fallibilism?
Well, no. Well, again, it's more that as a conscious being, I don't have much of a choice, right? Just because I have like if I have cognitive processes, does that not infer some truth about, I guess, something, right? Well, no, because that's still begging the question. Like, don't get me wrong, Intellector, I think that's his name. I'm very well convinced that I exist and that I have conscious processes and logic is true. I'm convinced of these things. It's just that the only way to be convinced of these things is to make a very logical argument. And I will say your argument was very logical, but that argument is only as good as in so much as you and I agree on logic itself. That's the whole point. Throughout this whole debate, we've never heard one justification for logic other than invoking logic to justify logic. And that's, again, circular. It doesn't increase your confidence. So, again, you just have to have faith in logic, my friend. Like, there's no getting out of having the need for faith, in other words, if you want to look at it like that. It's just that, where we have it and for what is just, it's a tricky problem.
All right. Looks like the last three questions are all for Anarchists. So looks like Jordan just gonna have to sit there and twiddle his thumbs, I guess.
No worries, no worries. Good luck, question, Anarchist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And looks like all of these other ones are from the same person. So this next one here is there any chance that we might be mistaken for our own existence when, I don't know how to say his name right, Descartes?
Yeah, Descartes. Yeah.
Okay. Said, I think, therefore I am. Was he asserting an infallible truth, or could he also have been mistaken about that?
So there have been several philosophers who have torn that to shreds, all right? For like, because it's been hundreds of years since he wrote that. There have been several philosophers, including some invoked here, who actually do believe in certainty. There's infallibilists who have torn apart that as an example of infallible truth. Immanuel Kant being one of them. There's other philosophers that have torn it apart, such as David Hume. This is like I reckon sort of like almost like it's almost like a rite of passage to be able to tear apart why this is actually not an argument that gives us certainty, because there are philosophers which talk about how it is in fact uncertain. Because like even if you say, okay, I think, therefore I am, I you're invoking this idea of the subject. The cogito tells you absolutely nothing about the nature of the subject. Is the subject merely conceptual? Does it exist in the external world? Is it made of matter? Was it put here by God? It tells you nothing. All it tells you is that, like it'd be like if I was to say God exists. Well, does he exist how? Does he exist as a form in the ideal world of forms? Does he exist as a physical thing? Does he exist as merely a conception? Even atheists can believe God exists as in the sense that God exists as a thought in some people's minds. You haven't really told us anything about consciousness. You just existed in your little stove. This is the classic retort to Descartes, is that he tried to do philosophy in a stove heated room and assumed he could just work it all out from there. It's not how it works, my friend.
All right. And again, let's see. If fallibilism holds, can we trust the structures of language and communication? Aren't we assuming a level of infallibility in these constructs to even discuss fallibilism?
I could promise you that not a single linguist who studies in this area is fallibilist about the constructs of language. With how tricky and how arbitrary and how messy language can be, there's nothing infallible about language itself. That's a very tricky argument right there, because otherwise, you're gonna have to deal with uh, this idea that analytic a priori statements are themselves like metaphysically true. Not just that they could be true, but they are metaphysically true. Which David Hume would come around and slap you across the face for saying something like that, because really it's just an argument from definitions at this point. A statement is only true in as much as its definitions hold, and we define our terms. Okay, we are the masters of our own definitions that we use. And yes, it makes language tricky, but my personal belief, which could be wrong, is that it is a miracle of God, my friend. That's the only way that it's and so again, when I listen to other people's languages and what they're saying, I try to understand what they're saying in as much as what is the most likely thing they mean in a probabilistic sense, given the history of how this word has been used. Though I could be wrong with how maybe they're using the word in a different way.
All right. I'll get to the next question here in a second, but who done it? Yeah, I tried doing the thing, but it just wouldn't bring up the next one, so I had to put the code in again to get the new questions because it just wouldn't let me move forward. So maybe something you might need to look into. But now I got the newer questions ready, so we'll get on to them. Again, this is for Anarchist from Intellector. I don't know if I'm saying that right. If we consistently hold the belief, could we be wrong? It might lead to decision paralysis. Yeah, I think I said that wrong. Because our action is typically predicted on belief in the correctness of our understanding. How can we act every belief, how can we act every belief could be incorrect?
Well, my version of fallibilism does not lead to decision paralysis, all right? Because if you're going for the most likely answer, given the system you do have, you're going to, and no matter how uncertain it is, you're always going to make a choice, actually. But let's just assume, for the sake of that, you're right, that it does lead to decision paralysis. Okay, yeah, and so what? What does that make a decision paralysis is not what determines whether a system is right, okay? Some may argue believing in God leads to decision paralysis, or determinism is decision paralysis, or something like that. And it's like, well, so that doesn't make it untrue. You can't just like point to a later thing like, oh, if people started believing this, then it would be horrible because then they'd start doing this, this, and this. It's like that doesn't make it. That has absolutely nothing to do with this truth statement. You're just making an argument for special pleading there. And I also kind of like how, when even though I'm not the one who's made the claim to infinite knowledge or like to have 100% truth, the infallibilists have made the broader claim here, and yet the only thing that they ever do is they point to other systems and they go, well, what about you? It'd be like, for example, if I said, um, according to my system, I am God, according to my system. And then anyone had a problem with that, and I didn't spend time defending that, only criticizing other people for having a problem with it. It's like, well, you can deflect and try to criticize other systems all you want, but if your system has more problems than other systems, why should we ever pick your system? It makes more incumbent claims and has less justification for them. So I'm not picking the system, no matter unless you can fix that, which you haven't.
All right. Again, from the same person. Okay, they didn't put who it was for, but I'm guessing it's going to be for Anarchist again. Seems like all of them have been. Even if I'm going to say his name wrong, Descartes.
Yeah,
Am I saying that
Descartes.
right?
Yeah.
Descartes. Okay.
Yeah.
If Descartes cogito.
That last one was right. Cogito.
Okay. Yeah, there's just some words my brain just doesn't process right.
Yeah, all
Sounding it out doesn't help. Doesn't establish continuous existence. Doesn't necessarily have to. Isn't establishing the certainty of existence in the present moment alone already a significant philosophical achievement?
No, because you've invoked the axiom of temporal succession in time to even like conceptualize that point. You've invoked this idea that there is such a thing as a present moment. What if we're in the future? What if we're in the past? What if we're just God's figment of imagination? Like you still haven't again, you're trying to begin with these starting points that you're like, well, can't you just grant me these starting points? Nope, not today. Not as certain anyway. I can agree with them in a fallible sense, but I can never grant them as certain. Like no matter what starting points you're going to try and put forward to me, I'm not going to grant you this wishful thinking that we have certainty about these starting points, because every starting point you give by definition is unjustified. So there you go.
All right. Looks like we have Ozzy in here with a question, and looks like now Jordan's got something to do because this is for both of you.
Yay!
Doesn't the cogito demonstrate that there is reality, but not the nature of it? Can't we know what truth is that we know with 100% certainty that there is something reality, yeah, with
Well,
some nature? Maybe we don't know. Maybe we don't know we exist without the laws of logic. I get that.
Do you want to go first, or should I, Anarchist?
I'm kind of confused about the question. So he says that because he mentioned something about the external world or the nature of the world. I'm confused at what the question's sort of getting at. Does the
Hold
cogito let me read it in the chat again. See if I whereabouts is it?
Doesn't the cogito demonstrate that there is a reality? Real?
A reality.
No, I thought that's what it was in the first place, but my brain tried to say it was wrong. Reality, but not the nature of it. Can't we know that is true? That we know with 100% certainty that there is something reality with some nature. Maybe we don't know we exist without the laws of logic.
Yeah, so like I think I see what he's getting at. So it's like we don't know what the nature of the self is or what the nature of reality is, but we know that there's a reality. Well, the whole point is that knowing its nature is knowing what it is or if it is, right? Existence is a part of nature, right? Like whether something exists or does not exist is itself a an aspect of nature that has to be verified, right? Like take the concept of God, for example. God either exists or doesn't exist. But you could still say that he's a, in what sense do we mean exists? In what sense do you think that reality exists? You're going to need some justification for that. And those justifications are going to be built on axioms which are themselves unjustified. So I might be able to agree because my system has the same problem, but you're only going to get agreement out of me, never certainty. I can never go with you all the way, right?
Jordan?
As for me, I like throughout this, I wouldn't directly claim the cogito. Like I think, therefore I am. That kind of assumes a self. I think like their consciousness thinks, therefore there is something. Like like consciousness, like kind of like Victor's self-positing I by the very fact that we can, you know, we can deliberate and can inquire and doubt in the first place that presupposes a notion of consciousness, or some sort of like mental state or whatever. And the main difference I'm having with I'm not a Descartes scholar, but I've like read that Descartes um, presupposes a notion of like substance self, which I'm not necessarily presupposing for this infallible starting point. And it's just the notion of like consciousness, like by the very fact that it's forced to deliberate by the way that it works, that it's infallible, that it works in a certain way, just by the very fact of how it is, that I think it can prove that it's infallible. And also, as I mentioned earlier, like the main transcendental argument that we can appeal to our other beliefs to support our axioms is the notion of that it aligns in with this, cogito. I can't say it either. Starting point is that like the ability to be fallible in the first place kind of presupposes a notion between the object outside of us and the notion of us ourselves, because the skeptic, whenever they makes a claim to reality, they always appeal to some possibility, some conceivability about how we might be in error. But that also that already presupposes the subject object distinction, which I think has to be infallible in order for us to even make sense of the possibility of error. So yes, I think it can tell us about error, about nature, by giving us a framework on which to do philosophy. And things like, my opponent said, like Kant disproved the self. Not necessarily. I mean, like in the antinomies, and also in the critique of pure reason, like he still takes that the unity of perception as the unifying thing in consciousness is sort of like a self. It's not identical, but it allows us to make sense of the world. And he also made this argument that in order to us to make sense of our fallible reason, we have to have a notion of, the outside world that is distinct from our perception. So yeah.
I just
All
also
right.
want to clarify. I didn't say Kant denies the self. It says that he denies the cogito as a certain argument. He then does go into a sort of transcendental argument to replace it because Kant is an infallibilist, right? But I didn't. I just want to clarify. I didn't say he denies the self.
Oh, my apologize. I was misunderstanding my point.
Nah,
All
that's all
right.
good because it's a reasonable. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. And well, Bully the Kid, I'll just let you know if you want to talk with them afterwards. We'll all be moving to Hangout. So I don't really need to ask that one. Ooh, this is a big one. All right, so we got another one for Anarchist from Intellector again. Let's see if I can do it with some of these words. While language is inherently flexible and evolves over time, there are rules and structures within any given language that remain consistent. Grammar, syntax, oh, I did that right. Punctuation, there's aspects, form, and infallible structure that allows for meaningful communication. For example, in English, we understand that the cat is on the mat has a different meaning than the mat is on the cat. For consistency in infallible within the scope of language's rules at any given time, this structure aspect of language can be viewed as infallible, irrespective of the words used. Language's purpose to facilitate communication remains constant.
Yeah, so that's a complete load of nonsense, to be honest, because there's actually a fellow by the name of Noam Chomsky who engaged on this project called the Universal Grammar System, and it was talking about like this exact point. You know, this idea that no matter which language or culture you come from, there has to be this sort of universal grammar which we know a priori. And I got to say, as someone who believes in a priori knowledge, you know, this got me excited. You know, because that would be an argument I would like to use. However, scientists have actually, you know, who have been testing this theory and studying linguistics, have been constantly poking holes in it several times over and over again to the point where the theory is all but abandoned because it doesn't seem to actually hold true. I mean, I guess you know maybe just I don't know. I had some papers on me before. I might have to go look them up again. But there's papers which talk about the flaws in this universal grammar theory. And that's why I would never appeal to language as an example of a priori knowledge we have, despite the fact I do think we have a priori knowledge. Um, and so, yeah, like language is just like we've tried to give that as an example, and the linguistic scientists have failed. You know, Noam Chomsky gave it his best shot, but it didn't work.
All right. Got another one from Intellector for Anarchist, I'm guessing. Let me double check. Yeah. Okay. So the next one, that's for Jordan. How does infallibilism deal with Hume's problem of induction, which suggests that we cannot be certain about our statement that goes beyond immediate experience? For example, we can't be certain the sun will rise tomorrow, as this is a claim about the future and not directly observable.
That's a question for me, right?
I believe that's for Anarchist. Or
Oh.
no, that's for Jordan. Never mind.
So I think I deal with Hume's problem in various different ways. One is that even if you like conceded that like we induction isn't true, most of my claims are like proved a priori, so that wouldn't attack inductive beliefs in the first place. And secondly, even if you like had to have it for some reason, like I think it would be self-undermining for Hume because if we can't trust that nature is consistent, which I think is one of the main things that Hume is getting at in the Treatise of Human Nature, and also like stuff on knowledge, is that he's getting that knowledge that nature has to be consistent over time. And if we like deny that premise within his own argument, then the premises of his argument couldn't rationally, or not rationally, but couldn't logically follow to the conclusion, because the nature like nature would change by the time that you get from the premises to the conclusion. Because remember, like for deductive or inductive arguments, right? They're premised on the idea that they will either probably follow or like they'll necessarily follow. It's different for both inductive and deductive arguments, but the point still applies that if he undermines the idea that like our logic or reasoning is not consistent, like it's not uniform over time, that applies to his very own doubt, and it's self-undermining.
All right. Looks like this is another one for Jordan from Intellector. Consider a Mobius strip, a surface with only one side, one boundary curve. Suppose someone traverses this strip and reports they've been on both sides of the paper, implying it has two sides. This is their infallible belief based on their experience, but it contradicts the infallible mathematical concept of the Mobius strip. How does infallibilism reconcile such paradoxes?
I'm gonna be honest. I hate if I'm gonna butcher this. I don't know exactly what it's getting at. So I think I just say this, that I don't think that all a priori, things are true. I mean, like there is a certain state like there's developments in mathematics that we might have thought that some of like Aristotelian logic, for instance, was like the best form of mathematical logic or for something, right? But now we find developments like Frege's logic and other principles over time. So we can still be fallible about some states of a priori truths as it applies to the Mobius strip analogy. But that doesn't imply it to all states like the self or like consciousness or things of that nature. So I'll just say that I'm ultimately not sure, but that's how I would respond.
All right, got another one for Jordan from Intellector again. The ancient philosopher Pyrrho? I don't even know if I'm saying that right.
Hero or
Pyrrho, Pyro,
Hero.
yeah, however you say it.
It's Greek.
Yeah, and people throwing weird non-American language at me just kind of throws my brain for a loop. And I don't say English because we don't really speak English here. We speak American, so
Yeah, exactly.
Puts forward that we can't.
Canadian. Sorry.
Yeah. Because when I think of English, I think of like England, so.
Yeah.
That person puts forward that we cannot know anything for certain without a citation of truth, yet we can't establish criterion? Criterion? I don't know if I'm saying that right. Of truth without already knowing something for certain. How does infallibilism escape this cycle?
So again, this is the problem with criteria we've been dealing up with. I think I think it's a very serious problem, but I think that we escape it because just like any other worldview, because we are committed to certain things, that it leads us to either particularism or coherentism, which I think coherentism is the more plausible option. Like that, I guess I would know infallibly. But the main response is to say that by like the skeptic's own life, there's no reason to prefer skepticism over the other options, and because we know that that we are committed to these certain presuppositions in our thought regarding either if you're a fallibilist or infallibilist, regarding how we exist as like selves or things about logic or reasoning or things of that manner. It gives us reason to prefer coherentism over the skeptical option, as basically Chisholm says in his paper. And I'd just like to add really quickly that even if you think that the problem of the criteria goes through, like, you can still be a Pyrrhonist and believe in infallibilism. In fact, that's actually a historical motive for why, like, some people adopted infallibilism or like skepticism, is they thought that because knowledge was infallible, um, that we didn't have knowledge about things, because how could we ever know anything infallibly? So it's perfectly consistent being a skeptic and infallibilist. But I just tend to think that we don't have to take the skeptical option, as there's good reasons why, because we need to account for the possibility of error. We need to account for, how we view the self and consciousness and other ideas like that.
All right. And looks like we have one more question. And again, this is for both. This is from Ozian. It's a follow-up question to clarify his last. Do you deny there is existence? I'm not asking what existence is or even if it exists.
Well, I'm not denying, right, that existence exists. I'm merely saying that if you can't have exactly 100% certainty that it does, only maybe the most amount of certainty you can have for any, belief that you hold, you can have the most for that. And I would say that I believe in that proposition to the point of being like 99.99999 recurring percent, like like confident that there's existence. Um, but yeah, that's all. I'm saying that there's always going to be that tiny percent.
Jordan?
I'm sorry, could you ask the question again?
Yeah, I said it's the follow-up question to clarify the last from Ozian. Do you deny there is existence? I'm not asking what existence is or even if you exist.
No, of course not. I think that of course existence is real, and we have to have existence if we're going to be talking about things in general. As I guess one of the uh, the categories Kant thought was needed for experience and argumentation is that we exist. Because even for an even evil demon layer, still has to exist in some fashion in order to, like, make sense of the evil demon, right? So yeah, I think we do need it, and I don't deny it, basically.
All right. So it looks like that's all the questions that people put in. So we will let you guys do your closing statement. And since Jordan went first, I believe, I'll let Anarchist start his closing statement and then let Jordan go next.
Alrighty. So my closing statement is I'm just going to sort of give a bit of a summary of how the debate went. Right. Initially, I asked for a couple of I put forward a couple of problems with infallibilism that I would, if I was going to believe in infallibilism, I would need it solved, sort of thing. Right. One of those problems was the problem of axioms. In order to make all these arguments that were put forward in this debate, you would need logic or empiricism to verify those arguments. I then brought into question, how do we know logic or empiricism is actually true, and which form of logic should we believe in as being true? Now, of course, when I pointed out that in order to even make any of these arguments, you could either make a circular argument by using the system itself to justify the system, and circular arguments do not increase your confidence in anything one way or the other, or you end up with a self-contradictory statement because you're using a different system than the absolute system of truth to verify which system is the absolute standard of truth. That problem was not really solved, other than it was pointed out that all systems have that problem, and that you're going to end up devolving into skepticism, potentially, even though I'm not a skeptic. The next problem was the problem of infinite regress, the idea that in order for there to be a relation in any syllogism between P and Q, you need to have an argument that P and Q are related. And then you need to have an argument that says that that argument is necessary. And then that argument is correct. And then that argument is correct. And it is each debate that you can have can be split into infinitely divisible issues. And because we don't have knowledge of infinities, we don't have 100% knowledge of anything. That is what is being required here. That was part of the burden of proof that was set by claiming you have infallible knowledge. And I do not believe that that standard was met. And to sort of wrap this up, I do find it very telling that whenever somebody makes a claim to infallible knowledge, their response is not so much to justify that claim as much as it is to try to look at alternative systems and tear them down. Being able to poke holes in alternative systems, especially when those systems say you can poke holes in my system, it's just the best possible alternative, right? It doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't actually it doesn't even touch the burden of proof that you've invoked by saying that you have infallible knowledge, right? It doesn't actually because my system of epistemology is that, you got to go with the most likely argument. Not only have I demonstrated problems with claiming infallible knowledge, but I've also not invoked any of these problems myself because I acknowledge these problems and say, for this reason that I invoke axioms, that I am myself a fallibilist. Sorry, I'm getting a call. Sorry. The alternative is to just believe in infallibilism, and then when anyone asks you why, you go, "Well, why do you think not infallibilism? You can't prove that infallibilism isn't true," and that's just not a good form of argumentation. So I yield my time.
Jordan?
Just so I can set a timer. How many minutes do we have, like, for the closing?
However long you need to take.
Okay, I'll try to make it short.
Yeah, and then we'll move over to Hangout once you finish yours, and then I do my closing thing. Then we'll move to Hangout, and then everyone can have an open discussion. So.
Okay, so to conclude this debate, what way have you seen? So my opponent has raised the idea that, like, the problem of axioms, like the problem of criteria, I've stated from the outset that even if you're a skeptic, that you can still accept infallibilism, even if, like, it just means that in order to know something, you have to know it infallibly. It doesn't say anything whether we have to know it. But I think that I think I justified it by the notion of the possibility of error in the first place. And yeah, I did appeal to, like, internal critique of other systems, but because other systems have other different commitments that they're committed to, by looking at those things, in different ways, like the logical positivists, we see that they ultimately fail in the end. And in terms of infinite regress, I questioned my opponent on, like, why exactly would it have to be an infinite regress. I don't think there was a suitable response to that question, because if there is going to be knowledge at all, it would have to bottom out in something, which I think would be, that could still be justified by these transcendental arguments, that things that are needed for the ability to rationalize and to be able to, like, talk about this subject in the first place, which is, like, the fictus self-positing I, and that the fact that it's like knowledge in the beginning is an act, that because we are conscious and it's our nature, that we need that's the way that consciousness works in order to be able to doubt things in the first place, that we just exist. And additionally, I'd like to say that, the problem of the criteria ultimately, I think, is not really addressed through the threshold problem, because, my opponent, most of my opponent's arguments were based upon the idea that, like, I wouldn't be able to have any absolute knowledge. But I'm saying even he wouldn't even have to have fallible knowledge, because there'd be no way for him to be able to tell when, something probable turns into something called knowledge, or a bunch of evidence turns into the stuff that we call knowledge, which I think that hasn't been justified over Pyrrhonism. That sort of, fallible knowledge still has to be justified in some sense. Additionally, I don't think that my opponent really addressed the Gettier cases, even though, if we have this we're fallible in the sense, It's still a major debate in epistemology that we have to account for these intuitions. I argued, I think successfully, that infallibilism is able to account for Gettier cases like the Mirage example, because we're able to say it's either it doesn't look at the water or it does. And lastly, another thing that went unaddressed, I feel mostly, there must have been some place, but I don't remember, is that the idea of like the implication thing, that in order to be able to deduce other claims, that we have to have certain claims as being true, because if you combine two claims together that are less than a probability, of like 100, then they'll always, combining the other timesing them, there'll always be less. So it seems that but by the principle of closure, that we will lead to a skepticism about the ability to reason in the first place, as in we'll always get less and less results by reasoning about things or deducing things, which I think ultimately leads to the conclusion that my opponent feared, which was skepticism. And my account is able to solve that because we have these absolute knowledge that we're able to, like, even if we don't know it in certain inductive claims, we can make conditional statements. And when those things actualize, we're able to, calculate from one thing to another, that one thing follows from another. So in the end, I think that ultimately infallibilism is able to account for knowledge and how we see the world, even though a lot of the beliefs that we have aren't going to rise to the status of knowledge. And we have no reason to prefer skepticism over infallibilism and possibly coherentism or particularism, because it's needed in order to account for error, that we can be wrong about certain things, which is sort of presupposed on the fallibilist framework, that we can be wrong about certain things. And in order to do that, we have to look at the subject-object distinction, which I hold is, at least for the subject element, to be infallible. Thank you.
All right. So I want to thank both of you for coming on and doing this debate. It's been interesting. Fortunately, a lot of it kind of went over my head, but I'm not well versed in any of this stuff. But again, thank you both for coming on and having this debate, and thank you everybody that has stuck around to listen in. It's always great when you come in and listen to these. And other than that, I want to let everybody know here in a minute, we're going to move over to Hangout. And I do want to apologize for butchering some words. I do the best I can with my learning issues, so it's not perfect. So, but thank you guys for helping me with some of those words and making sure I was saying them right for the most part, and correcting me. It does help. So, but anyways, thanks everyone again for coming on, and we will see everybody in the next debate, which will be the 28th at 1 p.m. So we look forward to that, which is on Avian Evolution Unleashed. So again, thanks everybody, and meet everybody in Hangout so you can have an open chat with the debaters. And other than that, see everybody next time.